All right, so today, from the first day of Automate, we do want to welcome Adam, who's joined us a couple of times before on the podcast. That being said, for those who may not be familiar with Copia, and especially with your background, Adam, because I think it's extremely relevant coming in from IT and bringing a lot of the technology we're going to be talking about to the OT side, could you please give us a reintroduction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think last year we ran into each other at a booth and we talked for about half an hour. So this year we just had the foresight to record it, so I'm excited for this conversation. My background, so basically before Copia, I joined Uber. I was joined originally on their driver team. We were hyper-focused at the time, or my team was hyper-focused on the app that drivers use every day to earn a living. So there's an important piece there of like high uptime, high availability, all of this stuff. I mean, you think about a line going down millions of dollars, think about how much it is when the Uber's driver app goes down. So kind of core to the business. And my team was called Driver Platform. So we were hyper-focused on, I think when I joined, there's around 4 or 5 engineers. We scaled it to 200. So it's like, how do you get 200 engineers working on the same code base and this kind of foundational sort of like set of workflows for the product there? And then I joined a team called Engineering Strategy, which actually I was just talking about with someone earlier today. Is really relate in a lot of ways to what I do now, which is really how do you get a whole engineering organization globally, which at the time was 3,800 engineers at Uber, to adopt similar best practices and solutions across the entire organization. It's a hard question, but I think it's very similar in a lot of ways to the question that a lot of industrial companies are viewing today as, they're looking at new practices coming about, they're looking at Industry 4.0, they're looking at, as we like to talk about, industrial DevOps. So how do you actually transform the practices and transform, the operations of these organizations? How do you do that in a way that makes sense for a very large, highly scaled, corporate entity,
Absolutely. So Adam, early on when we were talking, you were on Manufacturing Hub, we were very much describing kind of the early stages of industrial DevOps as being Git for PLCs. But Copia has expanded significantly beyond that in the last, almost 3 years since we've had that conversation. Yeah. What's new with Copia?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so, I'll start with Git for PLCs. And it's actually kind of funny because I have some of the very early decks that I had for Copia. And my thesis, which we mostly stuck to from day one, is like the foundation of a good set of DevOps practices is Git-based source control with code review, right? Do you know where your code's at? Do you know who's making changes? All of that stuff. Standard best practice, first thing every software engineer in the world who's doing DevOps practice turns up. From there, you have to ask, how does a product like Copia work in an industrial environment, And what we've seen is, the connectivity of the device, which probably makes sense, is really important, right? So, actually want to know changes in the environment. Ultimately, you're moving code from source control development practices to eventually deploying code in an industrial environment. So we came out with a product about a year and a half ago now called Device Link, where we connect to physical devices. And then we do have a product coming out, I think, in a couple of weeks where it's also dashboarding around this, where it can kind of actually tell you what are the unauthorized changes. So you have source control and code review practices. You have people that maybe just are pushing code, and I'm going to have to stop saying this after this, but it's the cowboys and firefighters analogy. People, shooting by the hip, making changes to the environments, then people putting out. Well, if you want to stop that, you have to have visibility into the changes that are happening in this environment. So really showing hey, this is an unauthorized change, then even building a dashboard so you have visibility into unauthorized changes in the environment. So that ends up, in my opinion, looking like the foundation of industrial DevOps. I believe that is actually the core foundational set of practices that any organization in the world could adopt today if they really wanted to and had the will internally to do so, which many very good companies do. They could adopt today and start to adopt. So,
And if I can throw a follow-up at you, Adam, on that same train of thought, and I think it's us also as an industry recognizing that it's maybe difficult to change those mindsets of, as you said, very core principles that are very well understood on the software side. So maybe how do we, as an industry, or maybe as you as Copia, educate some of these companies and help them understand the value and the ROI on some of these best practices?
Yeah, it's a little bit actually in this line that we were talking about with the platform industrial leaders need and engineers love. And, we had that talk on Industry 4.0 and why it fails and all that stuff. And I always say this, it reduces to the plant level ultimately. Any sort of organization we go to, you can have a top-down initiative, a solution that leaders need, but do the plant folks love it? Do the people actually using the product every day love the solution? And so for me, the benefit of a set of solutions like industrial DevOps, and obviously requires a lot of education, is that it actually benefits everyone in the organization. And one of the big things that we talk about a lot, and have been increasingly talking about, is blameless postmortems and thinking about challenges in an industrial environment as process challenges rather than as personal accountability challenges. You and I were jamming about this a little bit earlier, which is like basically right now someone makes a change, they break things. There's a culture in a lot of organizations of, well, that person messed up. If they were smart, they just wouldn't have done that. But any organization at scale, people do dumb things. I do dumb things. You know what I mean? Like I probably spilled coffee on myself this morning or something. You know, we all do dumb things sometimes. And so building a blameless postmortem process, build on the right tools, build on the right best practices, you can start to ask, did we follow our process, as opposed to this person's an idiot. And that process looks like code review, eventually looks like automate testing, eventually looks like, was it approved? Did a senior engineer look at it? Did we leave enough feedback on it? Oh wow, you just pushed this change to production. Now that's bad, right? Because you didn't follow the process. But if you follow the process, you're suddenly in the blameless world, and we're focusing on process. And I think that is where you can see this really compelling argument for individual controls engineers to actually take a whole layer of stress off of their job, because suddenly you're looking at process improvement rather than, hey, you're gonna get fired if you make a mistake. You know, I think it makes a big difference. But again, it's an education curve, you know, and every organization we come to, this goes back to engineering strategy, it starts off with this disaster recovery problem. And then do you want to do backups or do you want to be proactive? And we take people down the proactive path and then need to train everyone on it. But the core problem everyone gets. It's disaster recovery, things break, you need to recover from it. We prevent things from breaking, that's what we do as engineers.
Absolutely. And I would say, look, as a practitioner who's been to many sites, I can certainly recognize, you know, some of the smaller facilities, maybe having a single engineer who's managing all the code, and, you know, maybe that's okay until the factory reaches a certain size, but there is a scale factor at which this becomes simply critical, necessary, and you simply cannot avoid having these almost, as you said, like foundational levels of IT that are now are being more and more understood on the OT side, trickle in, right?
Yeah, the scale and scope of industrial production is changing. Environments are more automated than they were, and they're more code-driven.
So, Adam, one of the really interesting things as the conversation has progressed with Copia is the fact that it's gone from the Git for PLCs kind of the solution to disaster relief to we have to go put all of these changes and help organizations change and become better and have these blameless postmortems. What has the feedback been from your customers as you go and say, hey, it's more than just source control, it's industrial DevOps, it's this much larger system and solution?
Yeah, I'd say like we're lucky in the sense of, I think the problem that we're solving is a real problem and the pain point's a real one, and that normally when we go into organizations, I mean, I'll start from day one. Copia has been a company where, you know, we go in the door and people understand the problem exists. You know, we haven't always had the right language to package and solve that problem, right? And so once we start talking about industrial DevOps and put a language around it and talk about the set of best practices, and we've really started to land that messaging more, we've seen actually it's been really productive conversations because it enables people to actually understand like what we're doing and the vision of what it's doing and how it's supposed to. So packaging all up in a nice way has been pretty good. And so normally what we see, honestly, is when we go in the door, the teams we're talking with tend to get really sold. And then the challenge is how do you spread it to the organization? And that becomes sort of like internal best practices. And we invest a lot in customer success and that sort of thing as well, because we want to work really closely with the organizations as we go ahead.
Yeah, and I would say a great deal of that also was simplifying some of the tools we have today, right? Again, without naming any competitors or some of the other alternatives, I think you guys done a really great job at making it very streamlined, just as you would expect on a application level basis, right? I think that in our industry, it is not uncommon, let's call it, to see software that's been around for, you know, several decades. So seeing something that is cloud first, that provides tools that are much easier for engineers that can directly benefit them is incredible. So again, I've told you this multiple times, and I'm just making that statement. Like, I've certainly programmed those PLCs and I programmed the system, so I understand the pain points. That's why. Yeah,
I mean, and we're like, we continue to be hyper focused on those user workflows and working with engineers, you know, every day to make them better. It's kind of funny because it's like, I think earlier you asked me like, well, what's the big thing on your roadmap this year? And I'm like, the thing on our roadmap is working every day with engineers to make the product work well for their use case, right? And working with those workflows. So it's not always like the big shiny, this is like the big product launch, although we have one of those coming up soon that I think will be really good. It's generally speaking, like we need to get in the door and then even when you're looking at the solution like we're selling, I would say the gap between demo code and production code is very large in this environment. So building a performance solution that's reliable at scale, that's intuitive for customers, you really have to iterate on that. So I think the core platform is there, and then a lot of our focus is like, let's not get distracted. Let's make the solution very, very, very good so people love it and we don't see organ rejection within the environments. And that's where our hyper focus is as an organization this year.
And I can certainly appreciate that, but maybe someone who's not hyper-focused and is maybe thinking of some of the AI solutions, thinking of, how you guys can tie into PLC code and understand it. I'm almost thinking of how much more you guys could be adding across different verticals and different solutions. I'm curious, maybe, what are you thinking as the future of DevOps, future of Copia, maybe, and again, obviously without revealing any proprietary type of information?
Yeah, I went to a talk recently where they talked about kind of 3 layers of vision for a business. And so our current layer of the business is the core repeatable business where we can sell a solution to any industrial company in the world and it will work well and engineers will like it. And by the way, that's a hard problem. Okay, so just getting that right is really hard. I think we're rounding the corner on having a solution that I believe, as I said earlier, is the foundation for industrial DevOps. The next question is what's next in the industrial DevOps stack? Our solution, as I mentioned right now, source control, backup, monitoring. Monitoring, by the way, not in a SCADA competitor way, but very specifically tied to unauthorized changes in the environment, and very specifically code changes and giving visibility into that. And there's other solutions that do like network monitoring. We're not doing that. It's like very like what code, it's enforcement essentially of your source control practices. Then the next stage of the vision is industrial DevOps. Industrial DevOps to me looks like deployment. How do you get code onto manufacturing sites? There's a lot of regulatory reason why that's really hard. So like that requires a lot of product work and process change. So if you think about how hard it is just get people to git push and do code review, try git push and then push to your PLC from the cloud, right? And so we have customers who are kind of ambiently interested in that sort of solution, but the day-to-day reality of what you need to do there's actually a great startup over here that they just like videotape environments so that you can see changes that go in, and so it's like one of these things where it's like there's this line of sight requirement, all this stuff, especially in regulated industries. So, but that's the next stage of the product roadmap is thinking about that deployment so everything can go through the same system and you're not doing this kind of backup enforcement stuff. And then on top of there, automate testing has been a really big thing that we've talked about for a long time. There's a ton of solutions out there, emulators, SIMs, there are our TC unit, there's these automate testing frameworks coming out. I think Siemens has one as well, and I think Rockwell's maybe has one too. So basically everyone's coming out with automate testing frameworks. Now you have these testing frameworks that all the vendors have built, but you haven't built them into a workflow. Right. And so we want to build them into the workflow. And then again, you have SCADA and monitoring and all this stuff, but can we start to say, hey, this broke, can we give you visibility into that? So all of that comes down to a consistent practice where you're code reviewing, codes tested, it's deployed devices, and it's monitored afterwards, right? And that looks like DevOps. From there, AI comes in, and the way I view us is if you buy the industrial DevOps thesis, there's a lot of AI solutions coming out in software, code generation being a really big one. I think a lot of vendors in the space are well poised to do some of the code generation for that. There's specific challenges with code generating visual environments. And I think I've yet to see, although I haven't dug into every single one of these, so I don't want to besmirch anyone, but I haven't seen a solution that I know of yet personally, and there might be one on this floor, and I'm not an expert, that's really gone to that kind of production and quality scale with a code gen solution yet. Code analysis, you can add automate testing by basically looking at analyzing the code and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of code gen AI related stuff. How well does it work on industrial tool chains? Open question right now. And then how does it integrate into the very specific workflows people have? Open question right now. And so we're looking at all that, and I think there's a huge amount of room for impact. I think if you buy the industrial DevOps story, there's foundational sets of practices you can do, and you buy into the idea of blameless postmortems and process orientation for a business, for code changes in these environments, then AI becomes another piece of that overall story. And where we're hyper-focused, again, is the pain that we're seeing in environments as we go in there, and I think there's going to be interesting AI stuff that will come out, as part of understanding that pain, But the biggest pain is people make changes, they break things, and they don't even code review. So it's like we're talking about AI, and then again, I don't know, whatever, you guys know me, so I'm a little bit grounded in that way. But
I will say, I'm surprised a bit that you say that I guess customers are worried pushing code from the cloud, because I think the reality is engineers just push code from their office is the current best practice. There's really no code review, so if you're able to educate them maybe on what needs to happen in the real, again, DevOps DevOps best practice and CI/CD pipelines, I think you'll be able to overcome maybe that fear. And again, like we discussed this a little bit off stream, I think there's ways to maybe mitigate that or schedule that. So there's, I think that's the way the industry is going. So
we've definitely heard of people pushing like through VPNs and that sort of thing before, but there tends to still be a line of sight requirement in place there, you know. So like, and people might not always follow it, but I think when you're talking about like a global solution for an organization, like they tend to be like, well, we have a line of sight requirement, you know. Whether or not people are actually circumventing that, I mean, that's actually a big problem, you know, a big pain point. But the reality is, like, are people going to go now take that thing that people are doing that's kind of bad and they shouldn't be doing, and then make that their standard process, you know? And can you convince them to do that? I'd say no. Now, I think there's probably product solutions to this, but I think that's really where you're working with the organization. And again, it's a big level up for organizations just to do code review. Yep. So it's like getting even, you know, there's a natural kind of order to these things, I think, because you're seeing adoption there, and where we try and come into organizations and be like, what solution can they get through and adopt today to solve a massive problem, you know, that exists there.